My name's Morrod. I work for a research company, market research company in the UK called IHS Market. We're about 20,000 people. I run the research groups, the market research group, not the technology research group, on consumer technologies. And today I will give you 20 slides in 10 minutes or something unpleasant like that to try and give you a framework of how to think about how these big technology trends, what we term transformative technologies, so I put all the buzzwords on the first slide to get as many people into the room as possible, how these are kind of converging and changing, and it's kind of a conceptual view about how this is, how we see technologies impacting industries rather than a kind of implementation view, which you'll get from the other sessions, I'm sure. So without further ado, what are we talking about when we talk about big technology trends, big technology ideas, and why are we interested in them? So I've put some, again, buzzwords up on the stage, up on the screen. We're looking at these kind of overarching trends and how they can drive exponential change, so very rapid change across multiple different industries. And you'll notice immediately that a lot of the terms that we're talking about and a lot of the terms that will be discussed in the coming sessions are not actually brand new ideas. It's the use of them and the way that they converge together that's particularly interesting. So the story I'm going to talk about is that convergence of technologies in order to drive exponential change. So things like connectivity, we've had connectivity in some format for arguably hundreds of years and certainly decades. We've had cloud of some description, so centralized data centers again for decades, robotics of some description. I've had people tell me about PhDs they did in the 80s on artificial intelligence. So these are not new technologies, but the way that we're using them is new and the way that they're converging is new. So this is the story that I like to talk about. Again, big conceptual slides. We're looking for this change in growth rates across industries going from linear towards exponential, and we see that tending to happen as we stack technologies together and converge technologies into kind of a unified stack for a given application area. So if we talk again about connectivity, that's really just communication over a network. When we start to add cloud, IoT to that, we start understanding what's happening on the network. We add cloud to that, we start being able to keep a record of what has happened on the network, and we add artificial intelligence, machine learning to that, and we start being able to predict what's going to happen on the network. So again, that's the kind of conceptual framework that we're putting together, how to add technologies to cause things to happen much more rapidly or to make change much faster than it otherwise would be. Let's talk about how this has happened in the past very briefly, just to kind of prove that this has some pedigree, although again, with a limited amount of time, I can't go into this in too much detail. So I'll talk about something that everyone will be familiar with, which is smartphones. So this is smartphones over a 10-year period from 2005 to 2014. If everyone remembers what a smartphone looked like in 2005, I had one of these. This is a Nokia N95, if I remember correctly. Anyone else have one of these? There we go. Is this a smartphone? Maybe. We tried. So I also had one of the Windows phones that slid up with a keyboard under it. If anyone remembers those, they were incredibly frustrating. So we had a lot of really interesting technologies that came together to make this device. This is an incredible device that could, this type of device was incredible that it could be made at all. The display technology, that having that incredibly thin LCD display was brand new technology at the time. The SoCs, the antenna technology, and the operating system is what really turned this from a feature phone into a smartphone. But it wasn't really a smartphone until this happened a couple of years later. And what changed there is that they had an app environment on it. And so we started to recognize it as a smartphone. So we would still pick up the original iPhone and think, okay, this is a smartphone, this is something we've recognized as a smartphone. But the growth curve doesn't change at that point in time. It only changes when we add data connectivity to it. So when 3G iPhone came out, that's when it actually really kicked off the market. And so this is the general story about how these exponential changes start happening when there's a certain level of convergence of key technologies. And so this is the past, and we'll be looking into the future. I'll give you one other example of another case where this has happened. I had about 10 of these and then I deleted them because it's too many to go through in a short time. But fintech is a good topic to talk about at the moment as well. And this is, again, looking at a history, so this is only going from 2012 to 2017, and where we saw smart cards, e-commerce, and added to smartphones and cybersecurity, we go from PayPal towards Monzo, Resolute, and proper digital payment, and the industry kind of kicked and started accelerating in growth. And this acceleration is now encompassing other things like blockchain and artificial intelligence, which will be discussed today. So this trend does seem to hold, and we can see many examples where this happens. So why do we care about this in a broader sense? I mean, it's interesting that we can see technologies converge and then industries kind of start accelerating. What's particularly interesting about what's happening now is that we're starting to converge across multiple different industries, because the technologies that we're talking about when we look at robotics or artificial intelligence, network connectivity or cloud, these are technologies that span across multiple different industries. So we see consolidation trends across industries, which is why, and if we look again historically, this is why device manufacturers have kind of converged together and that industry exists itself. It's why telecoms companies are buying media companies at the moment. And so this trend towards convergence, this pull towards convergence, is something that we see historically. The type of technologies that we're looking at tend to have a wider impact. So if there's a technology innovation in artificial intelligence that might be applied over here, so let's say DeepMind beating humans at Go, that technology is then applied somewhere else, such as sorting patients' records in the NHS. And so we see very different types of reach and convergence across different industries, across different use cases. And this, over a period of time, this tends to pull industries together. And that's why discussions at the moment about cars are not about BMW and Audi, it's about Apple and Vodafone. And so how do different types of companies get involved in different types of industries? Is because the industries are pulling together, because they're utilizing the same technologies, and those technologies have much broader applications. Oh. Let's talk about telecommunications, let's talk about telecom industry trends. Again, in the interest of not having enough time to really cover this kind of stuff, I'm just going to flip through a couple of industries that have been brought up, and then I'm going to give a couple of closing big ideas to walk away from. So digital transformation trends in the telecommunications industry. So what telcos are planning to do. They have a tendency now to be looking at technologies that require convergence across multiple different categories of this technology types. So automation and cloud are becoming key drivers for the telecoms industry. And if we look back again historically, telecoms industry builds more networks, has more traffic, has to solve the traffic problems, so starts dealing with automation and edge network, cloudification, all of those kind of trends. And the interesting thing here is that where we are now in the middle with telecoms companies talking about how to involve cloud and artificial intelligence in network management will lead us towards new opportunities in the future about IoT and robotics and using those networks for broader applications. And so this is how these technologies tend to stack on top of each other. Again, another example, automotive industry. So as we move towards from cars being things to drive around in towards cars being devices, we've started adding connectivity and data collection information to data collection points to those cars, so sensors to those cars. This is a trend line on sensors, and the tendency has been, again, cars have gone from being rather dumb devices to being connected endpoints on an IoT network to generating huge volumes of data to adding additional sensors to those devices. And the future, of course, is something like autonomous driving as we add robotics and true artificial intelligence to that. So this trend, again, we can see in the automotive industry. And one last example, I promise one last example, is digital assistants. And again, there are many of these, there are many instances where we can see this type of technology convergence. Digital assistants are a good example of how companies like, I'll say, Amazon or Amazon, Apple, or Google are trying to interface directly with consumers, so they involve already a set of key technologies like cloud connectivity and some artificial intelligence, depending on how well you think Alexa answers your questions. What happened in the back is connectivity over the last 10 years to the consumer in basically every environment. As we introduce more devices that have these smart assistants capable on them, as we connect all of those requests back through to servers in California, we centralize all of that information. We start mining the information to come up with useful responses, and then we deal with the next problem, the future problem that will come up here, which will be things like security and blockchain and making sure that there's some privacy concerns. And all of these trends tend towards some cycle of centralization of information or power, and then trend to some disaggregation or dissemination of that power. And this is a really good example where we can see centralization of things like artificial intelligence and digital assistants through big companies, and then when you add something like blockchain to it, you could see that becoming much more disaggregated and being quite disruptive to the industry. So all of these examples have this tendency to cause exponential change in a particular industry, but also to disrupt themselves as that change is happening. Everywhere we look, we see technologies, we see the convergence of technologies driving industries. And so my background is in kind of devices and telecom stuff. And over the last few years, we start looking at maps like this, where we're talking about smart cities and agriculture, commercial transport, medical, energy generation. And the reason is that these technologies spread very widely. This particular mapping is mostly referencing IoT numbers because they're the easiest thing to turn into numbers at the moment. But the trend and the tendencies is there across all industries. So when the technology exists, where technology exists, it's getting deployed much more widely than many of the technologies that have been developed over the past 10 years. So a couple of trends to take away, and these don't unfortunately line up with the 3 sessions that are coming for the rest of the day, but there is, I'm sure, some overlap. But I just want to highlight a few things that I think are interesting to look out for over the next few years. So one is a trend towards video everywhere, and this is theory that we would go from an IoT-based sensor world, so where we have information about what's going on, to where we have video based on what's going on. And using that video and artificial intelligence in order to make inferences and assumptions about what is happening in different environments. So this is using, let's say, drones and videos in order to count cars rather than putting sensors on every car. And we see that working both ways, and as networks become higher bandwidth, as we move towards 5G and all of the other technologies that are required to make this a reality, we start generating lots of new business models and lots of new business possibilities that are based around the fact that we could have a video feed from many different locations. Anyone read The Circle or watched the movie? I haven't watched the movie. Anyone read The Circle? No? Okay. There's a good book for thinking about a world that has video feeds from everywhere. Next trend, this is more of a telco trend, so looking at how edge networks are developed and how intelligence and management is pushed down from a centralized data center towards the edge. And this is pushing capabilities, technology, and decision making closer to the consumer. So this device is pretty smart, the data center that it's referencing is pretty smart, and everything in between is pretty dumb at the moment. And so layering into additional intelligence between the device or the end use case and the network allows different capabilities, because we start dealing with problems like latency in a very different way. And that allows use cases that can't currently be dealt with through central networks. And this is one of the big promises of 5G, for example, and so I think this trend is also important, and again it shows a convergence of a lot of technology, and it shows the embedding of those technologies deeper into the network and closer to the consumer or closer to the use case. And the last one, which does line up with the session that's later on this afternoon, I wish I had a slide on blockchain as well, because that would lead up very nicely. Artificial intelligence clearly has a lot of importance, a lot of capabilities that we see across industries. And the most interesting thing here is how machine learning in particular as a structure of dealing with large volumes of data, as a structure of dealing with pattern recognition and enabling decision making, can basically be applied once built across multiple different use cases. And so where we see artificial intelligence in the current way that we talk about it, which is typically machine learning or deep learning, we don't see this barrier between where it's built or what it was intended for and where it can be used. And so this is a really clear example of where we see network with capabilities and technologies pulling together industries. And I'm exactly on time, which never happens. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. Since we have Tom available here, unlike what happened with our first speaker, perhaps we can take one or two quick questions, if there is any. Otherwise, you can catch him during the break. However, I have one quick question. Given your experience and given the analysis... Yes, yes, please. And given the analysis you made, which are the top 2, 3 market opportunities you see for businesses?
If you look your crystal ball,
across all businesses. Okay, so in terms of industries, automotive is particularly interesting at the moment. Yeah, autonomous driving and the pathway towards autonomous driving. The supply chain for automotive is very deep and there's a lot of money in it. So that's definitely an opportunity. In terms of technologies, artificial intelligence is too easy. Connectivity's been done, cloud's been done, and the economics of it don't really work with startups particularly well anymore. I would say blockchain and crypto and that direction has a lot of promise, but it also might not be very easy to make money from it just because of the structure of how it's deployed. So yeah, that's kind of 2 half answers, but there's a much longer discussion than that.
Sure. Thank you very much for your insights.